And hello again, this is Philip at thebest3d.com. And so now we'll go back to perhaps what we should have looked at before this one. This one here, we showed how to add the astronaut from an animated brush containing multiple images in the brush sequence. And this time, let me close that. What we'll do is focus on the background, right? When we see what we painted it on, it's an animation itself. So we have a short animation of this astronaut, and it could be many other things. Could be from an image sequence, like it was in this case, a sequence of Targa images, PNGs, TIFFs. You'll want to have them in Targa or in BMP when you load them into the animated brush. From here, load sequence, right? But there's other options. You may have, in fact, an AVI file. You can load an AVI, like such as a looping animation, perhaps, or some sort of a pattern, or some sort of a hand-drawn character animation, a walk sequence. Let's say you use one of the popular character animation and drawing and modeling tools like Poser or DAZ Studio. You could have this person not just spin around, but do a walk or a run sequence. But at this point here, we'll focus not so much on the foreground information that's animated, but rather the background. And so if we look at what's happening here, there is some sort of a background sky that looks very turbulent and tumultuous. And every once in a while we see, right here, we see there's quite a bit of animation. Let me in fact load another example. This one here is a variant of that. And you see that's something you can do once you have the original. And some of the originals, or some of the modified versions, this one here is with a slight perspective and animation, and also some post work for light diffusion. And you see those God rays or some lights, some beams shooting up from the lower right to the upper left. And so that sort of thing is also done in post work in PD Howler. But so before we can get to that stage, we need to have this thing here, which is purely an animation done in Dog Waffle as well. And I want to show how I created something like that. So essentially, it's plasma noise. Let me close this. Essentially, we start with a filter. Let me close the animation altogether here. Let's go to animation free. There. And start with an image. Let's make it 1280 by 720. Let's scroll down a little bit here. There. HGTV at 720p. Alright, so we have a single image and we need an animation, but a very short one. Let's create an animation of just 3 or 4. Let's do 3 images. And we will start with an image that we will replicate and then have another image after that. So let's start with the first one here. Go to the filter and render our plasma noise, right? And so let's just take the default. That's good enough. Let's store this image. We can do this with one of these shortcuts, right? This one here. And again, you can also do that from the image, store image copy. All right, just so we have a visual in a placeholder here, right? We can make this a little bit larger if you want to keep roughly the aspect ratio. Anyway, so this is the one image. Let's go to the next frame and click this stored copy, so we have a copy there too. So these two are identical. Now we go to the third one and create another image. And what I'll do is I'll simply render that again with the plasma noise. It could be also a different type. There's a couple of other patterns you can generate. Let's just do very simply another pattern with the same noise, but it will randomly generate a different type. You could even change the size, maybe make it bigger, and just click it a few times until you have something you like, and then click OK. And so now we have 2 different images here, right? Frame number 1 and 2 are identical. Frame number 3 is different. And one thing we could do, we could even add another, like extend it with the plus, insert a frame, and so we have that one duplicated as well. And as you can see, as we play through that, of course, it's going to be like doing a flicker back and forth. What we could do, first of all, let's store this, right? Now, just like we stored the images, like let's do this here, we have 2 images stored. And those two images are the only two images in that animation right now. And what we'll do, just the same, we can store the animation itself. And this one is such a short one, we can store this one to memory. It's not wasting too much RAM. So it goes quick, and we have a stored copy here of the animation with 4 frames. And in fact, you can scrub through that and see the 4 frames. Okay, so now what we'll do is we'll time stretch it. Now there's 2 ways to do that. One is to simply right click on this timeline here, or go to the animation and look at the frames menu. That's exactly the same menu here, and when you right click here you'll see that. What we'll do is we'll time stretch it. Right, and when you do that, you get a blended transition from one frame to the next. Now, this one to this one, they are identical, so you won't see any differences, right? It's blending this one out while it's blending this one in. You won't see anything changing. But from this one to this one, you'll see this one gradually fade away and this one gradually fade in. So you'll see a transition. So you can use that to stretch time and say, okay, I need to have that transition. Instead of taking 4 frames, I want it to take 123 frames. And I want the frame blending enabled. If you didn't, then each of the frames would simply be held in place for maybe 30 frames. And then the next frame comes in for 30 frames. And then the next one comes in for 30 frames. And you will just see it slowly change from one to the other, but still actually suddenly change. Right? It will hold it for a second and then suddenly change. That's not what we want. What we want is a transition where it's gradually changing. So if I do the frame blending, it will do that, and you'll notice now that the initial changes don't show up here because these 2 frames were the same, so it's blending from one to the same, but then here it's doing a transition. All right? So that's already an interesting little animation, and we could actually work with that, but we can do even more sophisticated, and I want to show you that. So I'm going to go click this animation that I stored earlier so I can quickly restore it, and we are back to just those 4 images. And that's really what I want you to learn too, also, is to keep in mind that you have this store capability, storing an image, storing a brush, storing a selection, and also storing an animation, because it's really good for your workflow to keep that in mind, to occasionally store it. It's also good for your workflow to occasionally save it, right? Storing it only keeps it in memory, with one exception, and that's with the animation. You can actually store it to disk. And if you are exhausting the memory by storing too much into memory, in the case of the animation, it will actually notify you and tell you it can't store it in memory anymore, so let's store it to disk. But at that point, you don't have much RAM left. So it's a good idea, perhaps, if you have a hard drive that's really fast, like a 10,000 RPM spinning disk drive, or a SSD. It's good to store them to drives and to disk, and in fact also to have a safe copy that way that you can restore if need be. So let's go and generate this transition in a different way. And of course, the way to do that is the motion estimation, the motion prediction module. So let's go to the animated menu and find the motion prediction module. And the reason I'm using that is that it's going to allow me to use some sort of a defect of the motion prediction algorithm, or one of its limitations. It's not a defect, it's rather a limitation. Right? How does the motion prediction module work? Well, first of all, what we do is we slice the image into tiny little squares. You see the squares right here. Each of these squares is going to be tagged with a motion tracker. Right, and then we're going to tell it, go look for where that square moved in the next frame. Frame for frame, it's going to look where did it move for each of these squares. Well, it's not going to be able to find it because it's changing to a very different image, and that's where it's failing, right? If it's totally different, it doesn't have a clue on how to, well, it rarely has a clue on how to best interpolate that. And interpret it and move it. It's still going to try something though, and the funny thing is what it's going to try is actually going to be very useful here. It's going to look pretty interesting. So let's first use just the default parameters. Let's set it back to 12. That was the default. And as far as the search distance, it doesn't even matter how far we tell it. Let's make it short so it doesn't take too long, because the farther you let it search for each of the tiles, the longer it's going to take before it gives up or before it thinks it has it. So let's give it relatively small, but let's make it a dry run just to get an idea, and go. Now this one is going to be very quick because we only ask for 3 tweens. So let's make it much bigger. Let's make it 33 tweens. And also let's not scan for dropped frames, and just do that. So we have now this turning from 4 frames to 67 frames. And you see an interesting transition, and it looks a little bit different from what it was with just the blending. Let's do that again, even with more. Let's make it 123 tweens. So it's turning into 247 frames. You see what's happening here now? We have an interesting looking animation somewhere in the middle. Beginning and at the end it's not, because it's going from 1 frame to exactly the same. But if you look again here, it's looking like some interesting dynamic turbulent changes. So what we can do is perhaps make this parameter, the fudge factor, much higher. And if we do that, let's say 4000, it's not going to do it the exact same. It's going to be more of a blended transition. Right? It's basically giving up because we tell it that there is so much noise. It's a very dynamic, noisy video, high fudge. It's okay to not try to track it. So the high fudge factor is what you use when you have actually video that's so dynamically changing that you say it's not going to be possible to really find the tracking, the motion tracking, to find each of the individual tiles. But if on the other side, if we tell it 0 or 1 or very small value, it's going to try, and it's going to do some sort of a morphing, right? And so that's what we'll do here. And this time what we'll do is we'll simply say, okay, don't do the dry run, and simply make it so. All right, so we now have 247 frames coming out of initially just 4. And there are some duplicates, right? Because we did have duplicates in the initial sequence. Let's close this. The last frame ends up being the same as the first frame, or the other way around rather. We see a transition here, and then the first frame gets to be a duplicate copy of that last frame. So we have a little jump here, which means we need to delete that first frame. Let's delete that. Okay, and so now we have a transition that's starting right away. So one thing also with the motion estimation or the motion prediction module, it's not doing a transition from the first to the second frame. Right, so it's jumping straight from the second on. And I don't know, there's some sort of a legacy there, there's some sort of an algorithmic reason. The point is that you need 2 frames at the beginning, even if you really think you only need 1. So that initial one, you need it twice. But then after that, you can do individual frames. And what we did is we transitioned to that. The second one, the very last 4th frame we had, is therefore not really needed. So let me do that again the simplest way. Right? The simplest way is you start with an animation, and you have 3 frames only, not 4. And the first frame, you'll put this in. The second frame, will put the same one in. And then the third frame, you switch to that. That's really, I think that's all you need. You need initially a duplicate frame, and then you need this one. And in fact, if you want to do more transitions, you can add. So let's do that, in fact, for a 4th frame, but let's give it yet another, or go back to the first one. Right, so there's a couple of ways to handle if you want to actually have multiple transitions. Let's go to a 4th image here and say something like, what was it, render plasma noise. And this time I'll go to a smaller size. And then let's go back 1 more frame. We'll have 5 frames in this case, and not keep this one. This time let's go back to the very first again. Right? So we have a transition from the first. We need that one twice because we're going to use the motion prediction module to then transition to this one, to then transition to this one, and then transition back to that. So we now have 5 frames. Let's go store that, store animation in memory. We might not need this original one anymore. And now use that motion prediction module again under animated subcategory for the filters. Motion prediction. And this time, let's keep it a dry run. But remember, we now have 5 frames. So if we do 123 tweens, that might end up being too long or too much memory. You've got to be careful there. Out of experience, I think we could probably go up to about 400 frames. Let's not push our luck here. Let's go to about 60 to see what that looks like. Right? And everything is still the same, 181 frames. And immediately it transitions, and then transitions, and then transitions again. So I don't know if you noticed that, but that's basically what we're after. Let's go and render those. And at this point, that's really the basic technique to create some sort of a turbulent effect. But there is much more. Right now, we have a couple of places where it looks really interesting. But at some point, we also need to make sure we don't do this jump. Like when we're at the very end of the animation, the next frame that comes back at the beginning is still okay. That's because of the motion prediction module duplicating the last back to the first one. So let's delete this one. But let's notice also after that, when we go to the last one and advance to the first one, we may see a sudden jump. Or not, because we actually went back to the same frame as the very beginning. Remember this sequence here? The last frame is the same as the first frame. So we actually end up making a looping animation automatically. All right, let's assume we didn't do that. Let's assume instead of this frame here, which is the first one, same as this one here, let's say instead of this one, we actually went to this one, which we have in frame number 3. This one here. Let's say we place that here for the 5th frame. So now this last one is not the same as the first. Right? You see the difference here? This one is the same as the third. Number 3 and number 5 are the same. So if we do an interpolation of that, this is definitely not going to be a looping animation because the last one will be different from what we started from. So let's go do that. Filter, animated, motion prediction module. And this time, let's keep it a little bit bigger. Let's make 70. And we should be good. Let's go. 211 frames. So now we'll see a transition back, not to the same as the very beginning, except that the motion prediction module still takes this last frame and replicates it back at the beginning. That's one that we usually delete here at the first. So we go to the first frame, delete this frame. So now you can see that we have a jump here. From the very end of the animation, when you play it, it's going to jump as it reaches the beginning again. Boom. See that? Let's do that again. From here. Dang. Alright, so if this is the case, and you still want to turn this into a looping animation where you don't see or notice that jump, you can certainly do that. Simply right-click and select Make Loopable. Right? With Make Loopable, what you'll say is that you have a few frames at the end that you would like to gradually fade away and fade over the same number of frames at the beginning. Now you can actually make it all the way from the middle. So you start with the first half, and then as you reach the second half, you start fading these away and start fading back over the same beginning. A couple of different ways to handle that, but let's say just the default, Make Loopable. Let's say instead of using all 209 frames, we'll only keep 156 frames. And the rest here is going to be cut away, not cut away, it's going to be faded over on the beginning again. So at the end, we essentially get a new looping animation. And let's see, for instance, if we go to the last one, next one is no jump, no sudden jump, right? It keeps going nicely and smoothly. All right. And so now you have a looping animation. Right? Now there's a lot of things you can do with that, and one of them is to turn this into a brush that you want to paint with. Right? So first of all, we need to store that. That's always a good practice. This one I'm going to keep to disk. I don't have a very fast disk here, by the way. This is also not a very fast computer. It's the 2nd generation i7, 2nd or 3rd. It's 5.5 years old or 6 years old. So what I'll do, I want to experiment with that in a couple of ways. What can I do with this animation? Well, first of all, I could throw a gradient at it so it doesn't look this black and white, but instead looks more like a red hot, fiery with a couple of bright spots in yellow. There's actually more I want to do before I even colorize it, and that is I want to displace it. let's make it a little bit shorter just for the exercise here. I'm going to time stretch it backwards this time. I'm going to say, let's make it half the duration, or maybe a little bit more, maybe 123 there, and still keep the frame blending, right? And so now I have a frame blended animation that's still looping, and I want to do something called self-displacement. So I'm going to store this one as well. This one I'm going to go to memory. It's short enough. Let's delete this one. And so I want to use a displacement technique to make it look even more turbulent. Right? We did this sort of turbulent animation using the motion prediction module or some frame blending or both together combined. But what we can do is make it look even more sophisticated. If I zoom in a little bit, there's definitely some room for even more self-displaced turbulent appearance and movement. And the way to do that is with a filter called displace by swap. What we mean by that is that we have the ability to put an image into the swap image, or the swap buffer as we used to call it. If we take a look at it quickly, if we switch to the swap image, it's currently blank. So, but we can put something in there, right? We can put something in this. This is basically, think of it like a layer, or rather the backside of your canvas. The swap image, you can switch back and forth to. I click on this icon here, or you click here under the image menu, you can jump to the swap image, right? There's a shortcut J for jump. Sometimes it works, sometimes there it is. You need to get the keyboard focus on that. But you essentially can jump back and forth between the main image. You see here in the top, Howler 10, swap. Right now I'm looking at the swap, and then I'm going back to the main. So in the swap image, if I have some sort of a pattern or an image of some sort, let's say, just to get an idea, a brick texture, right? Something like this. And then I set it and forget it, so to speak, and I go back to my main image. But now I'm using that brick pattern that's in the swap image as a displacement, right? And I'm going to go and displace it with that. What it's doing, it's revealing itself, because it's shifting the image one way or another. And one thing you can do is actually displace it in a couple of other ways. One or two that are really useful in this context is going to be the pool displays, the normal displays, and the color twirl. That's perhaps my favorite, but you'll see all sorts of interesting effects with that. The trick though is not to use a brick pattern like this, but rather another random noise generated pattern, something like another plasma noise, or even the same itself. Right, let's see this one first. Let's say we do something like this, and then we use the filter for displace by swap, and this time we'll take the displace, and you can see some interesting displacement happening. This is a great one to create textures that you use as elevation map in landscapes, as patterns also to generate textures like marble textures. A lot of things you can use with that displacement. And what I'm going to do instead of using this one here, I'm going to leave it blank, and then I'm going to say, you know what, the same animation we already have, I'm going to use it also as a swap image. Not just a static single image, but the whole animation, frame for frame, is going to move with it as an animated swap. And the way you do that, you use the stored copy we have here, and simply click here, use as animated swap image. Click that. Now, as you scrub through that, it will grab the current frame that you have in the stored copy here and place that or use that in the swap image. And therefore, if you use a filter like the displace by swap, right, you can use that maybe with the color twirl displace. You can use that to create a self-displacement. You can have the image displaced by itself. Right? And the beauty of it is that actually looks really, really interesting. You have some very fascinating displacements happening here. So I'm going to go and apply that not just on this one image. Instead of clicking OK, I'm going to click Ani for animate, right? And apply that to each of the frames. And so you'll see a fascinatingly turbulent animation coming out of that. So that's the starting point for creating some rather fascinating turbulent looking patterns that are not static, that are animated, that they are really turbulent in that sense. And you can see we're almost done here. 15 of one. I think the update is not happening here, but at some point we will be done with that entire calculation of the displacement. And I would certainly encourage you to experiment a little bit on your system to see what the speed is, because some of these displacement calculations are more time consuming than others. But check it out now. We have a nice little animation. We can zoom in a little bit to see it in more detail. And sometimes you'd like to blur it a little bit or add some motion trail or some motion blur. There's a couple of other things. You can go to the timeline. You could go to the very bottom where the animated category is in the timeline and do some ghosting. All right, so that could be an interesting one also. Do a little bit of ghosting and apply that. and then that way you'll see perhaps a bit more of a faded transition for the last 3 or 4 frames, whatever you select here, 6 in this case, except for the very first few, because it doesn't, the calculation on that doesn't wrap around. But that's okay. We can live with that and perhaps just cut a few of these off. But you see now some more transitions like that. And sometimes you look at it and say there's a portion you really like and some that you don't. So maybe you say this first part you don't need. Let's go set the in marker and then the out marker around here where it starts to get interesting again. But let's say we want to delete all that selected area here. Just right click that selection after you've made it and then delete this block. Right. So now you have a shorter animation, but it's focused on what you like. And maybe you want to turn it back into a loopable one and a seamless one and a longer one. All right, so let's practice that. Let's first of all make it longer. You could right click and do a time stretch on that. Or maybe you actually want it shorter. Maybe you want it exactly 60 frames and keep the frame blending. All right, so we now have this animation that lasts 2 seconds, but it's not loopable. So we can right click and make it loopable. And when it's loopable, again, we need to sacrifice a few frames at the end or a whole bunch of them, maybe all of them or half of that, right? And say that we want to keep 31 frames or 30. Let's go 31. I don't know if that's where it cuts it off or that's how far it goes. But we now have half of the last frames, the last half, the second half blended over the first half. So we have a continuous looping animation. This one's going so shortly though that we do see a little bit something happening. So something else you can also do is go back to the motion prediction module once more. You can go to animated motion prediction module and say those 30 frames we had, let's make them 3 times more, right? Tweens by 3, and essentially get it to, well, it's losing a few frames. Get it to yet another really interesting animated, interpolated, motion estimated transition. And so at this point, we need to make it loopable again. Let's go and make loopable. Something like, let's just use the defaults. And then also another one we haven't seen. Let's go and store this one first in memory. Let's get rid of this one. Let's go and store. Let's go and make this seamless as well, right? Because if we want to do something with this now, let's say first of all, if we want to expand the dynamic range, so we get darkers to get darker, the brighters to go bright. So we have the full dynamic range from black to white. If we want to look at it in a slightly offset position, let's say we want this area in the lower right to actually go to the middle. It's not going to be easily possible, because if we shift it, something like this here, transform and shift, right, you're going to see possibly a cut. There it is. There's a line. See this here, this crossing? That's where the edge was, and it's going to be kind of nasty to see that. So what you need to do is first turn it into a looping, seamless animation. Looping is one thing, that's along the timeline. Seamless is along the borders, right? So one thing you can do is simply go to images and make seamless, right? And tell it how much you want to overlap this. to have a fairly large, let's say we want about 20% or 18%, whatever the number is, remember what it is, if in case you need to do that again on another image that's kind of in parallel with that. And so here it's going through the entire image sequence and creating a looping, it's still looping, but also a seamless animation. And so now at this time, if you transform it, you can shift it and no longer notice any sort of cut or sudden transition. Another thing you can also do at this point is transform it into the 3D perspective. And if you do a rotation along the x-axis, that helps, see, because now you no longer see where that cut would have been in the past. And another thing you can do also is rotate it with the transform filter. You can move it around, you can tile it, and no longer see that transition. And you can make it smaller. See, if you didn't have the tile, this is what it would look like. You could rotate it, but you can also tile it as you do so. Because it is seamless, you will not see where the cut of that image was. And so that's an interesting feature. Let's apply that to the entire animation. And so it stays in the form of an animated, looping, seamless texture. Well, it's not seamless anymore now, but that seamless element that we had, well, actually no, it probably still is seamless. But what we may want to do also is perhaps pick a portion of that as an animated brush. All right, let's say we have a portion here. Let me restore this one, it's a little bit bigger. Okay, let's say we have a portion. Let me go and highlight that with the selection mask, ellipse to selection mask, something like this. All right, or perhaps a little bit more like a circle, something like that. And I want to, or even a smaller one, something like this. I want to pick this up as a custom brush. You know, you can do that simply here, use selected as the brush. And now if we enable the brush here, you can see it. Let's go with full opacity. Okay, and you can paint with that. But I want the whole animation to go through that selection. All right, so if I go back to that selection, and perhaps with a crisp or a rather slightly blurred edge as well. Let's do a Gaussian blur selection from the selection menu, or the box blur. Doesn't matter so much. Let's go a little bit of blur, not too much. Just a little bit of blur. So we have now, let's turn off that preview of the brush. We have now a soft transition on that selection. And let's pick that up, but let's pick that up not just once, right? So not this way, because that will allow us to pick the current brush, but it won't allow us to keep the animation through it. It's the same image as we're painting. It's a single static image. What we want instead, let's go undo that, is to use the custom brush selection tool. This one here, custom brush selector tool. Hold on, let me show that a little bit easier there. Okay, and you basically, normally you would just pick it up like this, but then it's again just one image. What you want to do really is select it from the current frame, maybe not the first one, just any current frame to the end. Let's say I want from this frame to the end. I'm going to place it here. Use the custom brush selector tool, there it is, and give it a little bit of margin since we have some blurry transition on that selection. Go from here, and before I let go of the mouse, I press and hold the Alt key, and then you see it actually go through that. And let's say we now want to paint with that. Let's go clear the selection, or store it. We might want to use it again, so let's go to selection, store selection, or you could do that right here as well, store selection. Right, so you have a stored copy of that selection mask, and then you can clear it, and you can now paint with it. And as you're painting, especially if you keep the step distance a little bit closer, you'll notice that it's actually an animation here. It's going through it very quickly and very softly. If you go slowly, you can see that there is a bit of turbulence movement showing in there. So that's the idea, is that we want to pick up that animation that was seen through the selection mask. Let's replace that selection and do that again. This time not from the last few frames, but from the very beginning. So we pick up the whole animation through this through this opening here. Let's go and disable the custom brush so we see it better. And so we essentially want to pick the custom brush from about here to here, and with the Alt key, press and hold the Alt key, and then let go of the mouse while the Alt key is still down. Right, so now you see it's picking up through the entire animation and loading that into the brush. You can store that brush from the brush menu, store and manage a copy of that. And you now see, for instance, if you go to show film strip, and you can scroll this down here, you can grab it, you can see it's actually animated in here. These images are not identical, they're moving, it's the animated brush. Let's go paint with that. Let's go selection clear, and as you're painting with that, perhaps using step distance 1 or 2, let's give it 2. So now you see, as you're painting, you have the turbulent animation inside the brush image. This is a sequence, an animated brush, also known as an anim brush. All right, so that's one way to use this, right? One way to use this turbulent animation is to actually transfer it to the brush so you can start painting with that. And there's a lot of reasons why you might want to do that. A lot of things you can do also to further refine it. Under the animated brush menus, there is a timeline. There's an animated brush timeline, and you can use that to preview and modify what's happening across the timeline. You could change color, right? Very simple things here. You could say, let's go from initially, let's reset it. Let's go from gray to gray at the very beginning. So here's your timeline in the brush, in the animated brush. Let's make this a little bit wider. And so let's go and set a keyframe here. And also another keyframe at the very beginning and at the very end. Same keyframe. So it's actually going to be a looping, still a looping animation. But in between, maybe around here, we'll go reduce the amount of red. And then around here, we'll re-increase the red and actually go beyond the original value and reduce the green. Keyframe that. And then here, we'll increase the blue and reduce that. Maybe increase the green as well. So now we have an animation that's going to go through several color changes. Let's go and render that. And if we want, we can have that transition, that color change, kept. We can keep it so it goes back to being the source. If we want to do more transitions, we could go and do some threshold calculations. We have all sorts of things we can do with that. This doesn't look too interesting. Tinting, hue changes, right? We can change the hue. So for instance, we could go to the first frame and keyframe it there, and then go to the last frame and give it a different hue and perhaps even more saturation. All right, render that. So now it will go through changes in color and hue and saturation, and keep that one. Or you could say I'm done, and you could do a transfer that destination, the lower area here, the lower image sequence, to the custom brush. If I'm not done, I might still do others. There's lots of filters here that apply directly to that animated brush. So let's go, for instance, do some of the transform things here. Transform, globe, mirage. Let's do the transform filter and scale it. Right? Make it a little bit smaller or a little bit bigger. Now, don't be fooled by this. This preview here is a little bit glitchy. What you want to do is just trust it. So let's go to the first image, and you'll see it a little bit smaller here, but it will all look really good once it's done. It's just that the transition here is not very good in the preview. But what we'll do is we'll rotate it, and we'll also scale it to go bigger. And so now we can render that, and you'll see it's transforming through this alpha channel. Okay. And let's go keep this, but also let's go actually use that. So let's use the destination as the current brush. We're done with this here. So now let's store this newly created animated brush. So we have a safe copy of this one. As we review the content, you see that indeed it is changing size, it's changing hue, it's doing all sorts of wacky things. The last frame here, for some reason, didn't get a good update. Maybe we don't want this one. So let's delete this frame. Delete the last frame in the animated brush. And now we have very pleasant animation that as we paint with it, it's creating all this wacky thing. And while we have these color changes, it's still also changing the animated turbulent, cloud system in there. All right, so there's a lot of things you can do with that, really. It all amounts to creating this kind of cloud pattern is how to get to it. All right, so as a recap, how did we do that? We start with an animation of just 3 frames, as a minimum 3 frames. And in the first frame, we will go to render perhaps one we already stored. Let's do this one. In the second frame, we'll do the same. And in the third one, we'll do another one, either this, or let's do for the final run here, let's do a different one, maybe the bumpy toy. And there's some purlin noise, spiky purlins, different scale, self-displays with color, all sorts of really funky stuff you can create with this. Let's do without the gradient, but with more self-displacement and a little bit bigger. There you go. All right, okay that. So now we have one frame and another frame, and we do the motion prediction module, animated, where is it? Animated motion prediction module. And we'll say this time from the 3 frames, we'll need to make 70 tweens, and that will give us a total of 71 frames for animation. Funky stuff, but very useful at times. And this one didn't quite come out the way I was kind of imagining, but let's do another 2, and that'll give us 205 frames. So it's a little bit slower now, and we are starting to see some interesting things here. All right, the ones I think I would focus on is really the transition from one type of image to a similar type of image. But there's plenty of room for further exploration. So again, we do create just 3 or 4. Let's do 4 this time, or the magic 5. Why not? Let's do 5 images. And the first one is this. Let's do that one twice. Next one is this image, and then the 4th image we will set render plasma noise one more time, and then this one will do plasma noise again as well. Render plasma noise, and let's see if we get something. There you go. Let's use this, or maybe a different mode. Let's say a difference mode. That one has some veins showing already because we had an image in it and we're adding something to it. You'll get some of these type of river canyon style patterns, and maybe that's what we want to explore as well. See if maybe that will give us some lightning or something like that as we do the motion prediction module interpolation. All right, so at this point we have a short animation. Let's go store this one. Store to memory. Get rid of this. This we don't need anymore. All right, so here's our short animation. Let's go one more time. Transform, no, excuse me, animated motion prediction module. You guys should lead me now here. I've done this so many times. Let's go 88 this time. 88 times. Let's see what that gives us. 265 should still be good. And so now we see it do some interesting turbulent pattern animation. And we are good to go with perhaps a make loopable. And then after that, make it seamless. But I mean, look at that. That's already a really interesting, even as a static image, this is really so interesting looking. Right. I think this should be loopable now. Yep. Let's go and store this one and self-displace it. So animation, store. Let's go to memory. I think we have enough memory for this. Let's flag it as the animated swap, right? And so as we go through this, we can now use it also to, we could click this little, this big button in the upper right and blend it in a couple of ways. Soft, divide, oops, no, that's no good. Every image divides by itself. Screen mode. There's a couple of funky reflection modes. Some of them will be very interesting as a means of creating very turbulent appearance, also in terms of the colors. Hard light, soft light, color dodge. But let's do without for now. Let's just say, well, because we have it in the animated swap, we can go and displace it by, for instance, the normal displace mode. And you see that that can lend itself to very interesting new animations. And it's taking its toll on the calculations, but it will take a few seconds to complete. You can probably get faster results. If it stops animating, it doesn't mean it's not actually doing it. It's just taking its while. Give it some time. Even the update here on the frame count may no longer be showing. It's really focusing on doing the work rather than telling you about it. So here is the animation we have so far, and you know, nothing stops you from trying even further. Let's go. Let's make it half that. Let's go make loopable to half of that animation, about roughly that. So we have 107 or 108 frames coming up soon. 107 frames now, and let's use that. Let's store that animation store to memory, and this one we can get rid of. This one we can get rid of. Here's our stored animation. Let's designate this one as the animated. Right, and there's one more thing we can do. Let's first animate and displace it by itself. Displace, this time with the, let's do the regular displace filter. Right, something like this. Let's go around here and animate that. But I want to show you one more thing you can do. It's not only the image sequence in the swap, you can also use this as a selection mask. You can make it an animated selection. Click that, and as you go through it, you'll see the selection mask is changing. The marching ants, if it's not the marching bands, the marching ants is going to select differently based on that grayscale image. Right, so it's an animated selection, and what that allows you to do is basically make it a displacement that is not going to be the same all over. So you could apply now that same displacement filter, maybe the pool displace for a change, and you see it's only happening in some areas, right? And let's say, for instance, we want it in this direction, but those that are bright and highly selected will get some of that transform, whereas those that are dark are no longer being affected by it. So there's really a lot of things you can do here by combining that, because soon enough, if you clear that selection, hold on, let's wait until it's done. There you go. Let's undo this selection. Let's clear the current selection. So now you have cloud patterns that seem to change faster in the bright areas than they are in the dark areas. Right, so it's very subtle, but it can create some really fascinating results. Maybe sometimes you want to crop to a portion and do some more work with that. So use the crop tool. Right, and there it is, and perhaps zoom in to something of particular interest and say, okay, something like this. Keep it roughly the aspect ratio you need, crop to that, but be careful when you do this crop. It's probably not an even number of pixels anymore, so you may need to resample it as well. Let's make, where is it, resample? Yeah, see there is a 711 here. Let's go to 800, either up or down. Right, maybe 640 is fine. 640 by 360. Let's uncheck the constraint and say 360. Then that way it's back to a nice standard resolution. And as soon as it's animated, we can scale it back up if we want to, back to 1280 by 720, or 960 by 540. But at least we can rest easy that this can be easily saved to AVI as well. And in fact, let's do just that. Let's go animation, save AVI, and make sure you know where you want to save it. You can always specify that here too. and I'm gonna go to my presentation and save it here under turbulent clouds, and yet another one, yet another turbulent cloud. Okay. Save that, and then save to AVI with the proper codec. I love the Lagarif codec, but I'm going to save it to Xvid this time, simply so I can post it directly into YouTube. But if I want to work with it, I don't want it lossy, so I'm going to use a lossless codec. And this one here is not only lossless, but it's still compressed. Lagarif is free, it's fast, it's multi-threaded, it is lossless, and it's perfect. So I'm going to use that. And of course you have to make sure that the dimensions of your frames are compatible with the codec. Most codecs will have trouble if there are any odd numbers in the dimensions. You don't want it to be 711 on the width, or let's say 365 on the height. That would not be good. So after you save it, make sure you also show it. Make sure that your regular media player can actually see it and displace it, or show it and animate it. Alright, so if that's done, then we can still keep going with that. Let's go and animate it. And you know what? I'm going to keep going forever here. This is the beauty of it, is that I can. I can go and make this the animated for yet another animated transition here, or displacement. This time I'm going to use the color twirl with a little bit more of this animated. Now, one thing you also want to do at some point is a little bit more of a drama on the color, right? So once we have this animation, you want to first of all add a little bit of dynamic range, so we get dark and bright all along. Some of the frames will get exposed, overexposed, but that's okay. We can have that. And so the next thing you want to do is throw a gradient over that, to make it more like this reddish and yellowish fiery look. So you need to go to the gradient tools, and there's a couple of ways to get to that. There's a gradient editor, there's a sweep editor, my preferred one, or even the fill settings, at which point you'll see a gradient right here. You can click on that to see the prefabs or the predefined gradients, and I will use something like this one here, right? Yellow to dark through the red zone. But then you want to also use the sweep editor to further refine that. So this is the currently selected gradient. We don't need this anymore. The sweep editor here, what I want to do is first of all switch it so it goes from dark to bright, because we want the dark part still to look dark. So we need to go from left to right in the same range. From dark, and then whatever is white or really bright here will turn into this yellow. Maybe we want really white there too, so let's go to the green and the blue channels, not just everything all together. But let's go, red is fine, green we will need to stay up here, and perhaps give it a little bit of smoothing, press and hold. Go to the blue, and with the blue we definitely need to add some of that, so that we also get in there. Alright, perhaps less blue until the very end, and then we can smooth this and have a nice bright spot. Now we may want to have a little bit of blue earlier here too, so that it kind of gets a bit of a magenta-ish look, right? Something like this. Okay, so that's how you work with the red, green, and blue channels on the gradient. And now, how do you map it? How do you get it to map onto that image? Well, we have a filter for that. It's not an app, it's a filter. Here it is, color map to current gradient, and voila. And apply that to all frames, you betcha. Let's go across the entire frame sequence, and we can still make it loopable again if necessary. Okay, that. We can still also make it seamless in case that is necessary. Maybe a little bit more overlap. Okay. And then we can also stretch it one more to make it a little bit shorter lived, or slower, longer lived really. So we could do time stretch, or once again, even in this colored condition, use the animated motion prediction module. And you can see a pattern here. I'm repeating myself here a few times here, right? I'm doing this over and over again just to make sure that you really find this totally natural. And go do that. Oh, that's too many frames. 6,700 now. Let's do it four times. 300 frames should be fine. This is a smaller animation, so we can easily go to 1,000 frames, I'm sure. But so now we have this sort of turbulent cloud pattern starting to really show through here, and that's the beauty of it. So it's still loopable, it's still seamless, and so if you want to turn this into an animation of a slightly different kind, let's say you have a spaceship that goes from left to right across, let's say this is the front of a sun or a star or some cloud that's like gone supernova, or it's after the Big Bang, and you have a spaceship going. I don't know how quickly they build spaceships right after the Big Bang, but let's go and have an animation where we look from left to right. Right, so one fairly decent way to do that is in the timeline editor, going to the 3D perspective filter, and in the 3D perspective you can change the direction in which you're looking sideways as well, so you could look from the left and go to the right. Right, so something like this initially, go to the right, maybe a little bit to the upper right. There you go. Okay, and so we have an animation where our camera is changing, but also what it's looking at is still changing. It's still that turbulent animation there. And now it's of course time to add something on top of that. And that would probably be best served with some sort of a spaceship flying across it. So we can see the animation that we currently have here, and we need a couple of spaceships going from left to right. So let's go. I'm gonna go load that from my brush, animated brush, load sequence. There, load sequence. And when I load a sequence from my animated brush, in my presentation I have a couple of 3D shapes. No, not flying teapots. I'm gonna get me a spaceship here. There's a PNG sequence, there's a Targa sequence. I'm gonna look for Targa and just select the first one. It's gonna select everything that has the same base name. There's a temp Targa, it's not gonna use that, but if it is, we can always delete it. So let's go load that, and this is not loading here, we don't see it here, it's loading into the brush, it's turning into a custom animated brush, and so the spaceship we can then simply fly it from left to right. Well, maybe we need to give it a slightly different orientation. So animation, or brush rather, store and manage a copy, and now simply show it. Let's see, we can paint a little bit here. There's my spaceship, undo that, and give it a little bit more red. Since the whole thing is reddish here, we want to show some red, green, blue. We want to show a little bit more red saturation, and it's applying that over the entire frame sequence. We can reduce the green, we can reduce the blue, we can increase the saturation. There's a variety of things we can do here. And so now we have a spaceship that we can animate. Probably best painted across it, but we need to have a shorter distance on the step distance here. Something like this. Maybe make it a little bit smaller. There you go. And then also go simply, a slightly different orientation. Let's rotate it slightly. There you go. No, that's probably too much. Let's go a little bit back, something like that. And now simply bring it from left to right. Right. So start from the outside if you want to not see it initially. Make sure you're at the beginning of the frame, or wherever you are, you can start from here. and say, okay, this guy just suddenly appeared. Press the Alt key and paint from left to right, and the spaceship will go across. Now, maybe it's a whole invasion, an armada of spaceships, so you can keep going several times, and you'll start seeing some others going across there too. Maybe you want some of them farther away or smaller, and you probably should paint them first, and also the step distance should be a little bit lower, so you see them go slower. But now soon enough you'll see a whole sequence of spaceships going across there. Alright, and then once that's done, you're ready to export it and do it. Hey, thanks for watching. Hold on, I was moving my microphone here. Let's cut this one to the end, and see you next time.